We're on Test Summit Bay is 9B2. 9B2, right hand column in the art scroll, the last paragraph. Okay? So now, today we're continuing on the Agadita line, on the esoteric line, and so there'll be a lot of discussions along the way, most of it ethically based, and so let's get moving along. So we talked about the why was the first Beis Hamikdash destroyed, because of the three averis of Gili Arayis, Shlichus Damim, and Avodah Zarah. And now we're getting to the second Beis Hamikdash. Aval Migdash Sheni, regarding the second Beis Hamikdash, Shahayu Oiskim b'Torah b'mitzvos k'milas chasodim b'pnei ma'achar. But in the second Beis Hamikdash, where they were actually very involved in the study of Torah, doing mitzvahs and acts of kindness, why was it destroyed? Because there was baseless hatred. The famous line, sinas chinam, which, for the best way to understand what baseless hatred is, lashon hara. That's what it was. In essence, as we're going to see, the Gemara is going to talk about it. It was lashon hara. It was being two-faced. It was being two-faced. There was something on the outside looking very holy, but on the inside quite rotten. To teach us to teach us that baseless hatred, i.e. lashon hara and the like, is worse, is tantamount to all three averis of adultery and immorality and bloodshed altogether. Because there is something insidiously wrong with being two-faced, by showing one face on the outside, but behind the guy's back, you're talking about him, you're talking lashon hara, you're stabbing him in the back. And the Gemara is going to go into this. We're now on 9b3. 9b3. Rishoyim, the Gemara states as follows. Rishoyim hayil ela shetolu b'techayim b'HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They were wicked people, but they placed their trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the Holy One, blessed be He. This statement is coming to talk about the first Beis Hamikdash. Diksiv, because it said, Roshel kishoichad yishbetu v'kayanel b'mechir yoru b'nefiyah b'kesef yiksaymu. Her head judges were there for bribes, and her kahanim, her priests, gave out rulings for money, and her neviim said nevuah for money. Ba'al Hashem yishanu, but they relied still on Hashem, lema, saying, Haloi Hashem b'kirbeinu, isn't Hashem in our midst? Like Tavi Aleinu Ra, nothing bad will befall us. Lefichach, therefore, Hevi Alei HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shleish Gezeres. So the Holy One, blessed be His name, visited upon them the Eden of the first Beis Hamikdash 3 decrees. Keneged, against the Shleish Averis should be other, the 3 Averis in their hands. The 3 Averis were either Avodah Zarah, Shlichus Damim, and Gili Arayis, or the 3 that we see here in this pasuk. They took bribes, they did rulings for a fee, or they sent the nevuah for money. So, Shenema, because it says, L'chein, therefore, B'gilalchem tzion sodeh techares Rishalayim iyan tiyeh v'har habayis yoeh. Therefore, because of you, Tzion shall be plowed as a field, and Yerushalayim shall become ruins, and the Har Habayis shall be like the high places of the forest. 3 different areas of destruction. So, says the Gemara, but in fact, are you saying that in the first Beis Hamikdash there was no sinas chinam, that it was only Gili Arayis, Shlichus Damim, and Avodah Zarah that were the problem, but not sinas chinam, baseless hatred? But it says as follows: Migure shel cherev hoyu es ami lochein sepaikis yorech. Cry out and wail, son of man, for it was among my nation. It was among the princes of Israel, the greats of Klal Yisrael. Fearers of the sword were my people, and therefore smite upon my thigh in grief. But Amar Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Elazar said, these are people who eat and drink together. They act friendly one to another, but behind their backs, they stab each other in the back. But they stab each other with daggers with the tongue. Or as Shlomo Melech said, Misa b'chayim ala loshen. That death and life are on the tongue. Because loshen hara is a terrible thing. Gossiping about another person behind their back while smiling at them while you're facing them, there's nothing worse than being two-faced. Says the Gemara, so you see in the first base of Hamikdash, they had the same baseless hatred as the second base of Hamikdash. Says the Gemara, no, because the pasuk is Hafu b'nesiya Yisrael have. It's only by the princes of Klal Yisrael, the leaders, that behave this way. Except Za'ak v'hilal ben odom kihi hoisa b'ami. Cry out and wail, son of man. It was among my nation. It was among the princes of Israel. V'atanya Za'ak v'hilal ben odom yachalakol. I might have thought this is referring to everyone, that everybody was behaving with baseless hatred. Talmud Laima, he b'chol nesiya Yisrael. It was among the princes of Israel. So since the baseless hatred was only among the leaders of Klal Yisrael, essentially they looked down on the masses and they spoke against the masses. But the masses themselves did not have baseless hatred one to the other, and certainly not to their leaders. The Navi, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not look at the first base of Mikdash as a problem in Sinas China. Comes the Gemara and goes further on this line. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar de Amr Tavaya. Rabbi Yochanan and Elazar say together. We are now on 9b4. 9b4. Rishonim, the early one, shehiskala avoidam niskala kitza. The first ones in the base of Mikdash, the base Rishon in the first base of Mikdash, did their averis openly. They did Avodah Zarah openly. They did Gili Arayis and Shrichas Damim openly. So therefore, their end, that they would only be in Golis for 70 years, was revealed to them. Achrayim, but the ones of the second base of Mikdash, Shalai Niskala Lavainam, whose averis were not revealed because they spoke Lashon Hara, Sinas Chinam, behind people's backs. So they did everything Bahaltin, hidden away. Loinus Galakits of the end has never been revealed. And so after all these centuries, we're still sitting in Gullus and not knowing when Mashiach will come. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the fingernails of the earlier generations were better than the entire abdomen of the later ones. In fact, the later generations are better. Because even though they're subjugated to the dominions of the foreign kingdoms, there's still Isaac and Torah. Because in fact, during the Bayis Rishon, mostly we had autonomy. Mostly we were ruling ourselves. So Mashiach in the second base of Mikdash, there was almost no time upon which we were completely independent. First with Persia and the Medes, later on with Greece, later on with Rome, all had a great heavy hand upon the runnings of our nation in Eretz Yisrael during the second base of Mikdash period. So it was much harder to learn especially during the Hellenist period of the second Beis Hamikdash, and Im Kol Zeh, this was the time of the great birth of the Mishnah and everything else. What is fascinating about this is it happened once again. In the terrible times of the Dark Ages, specifically the times of the Crusades, in the late 10th, starting with 1095 in the First Crusade, all the way through the Spanish Inquisition, was a terrible time for Jews to be living. And yet, during that terrible time, from the late 1000s to the beginning of the 1500s, that 400 or 500 year period, that's the time of the Rishonim, Rashi, the Bali Taisis, the Rambam, the Ramban, the Rosh, the Marami Rutenberg, the Rashba, the Ritva, so on and so forth. In our worst period of time, in our time when it was the hardest to act as a Jew, was the greatest flowering of Torah. Says Reish Lakish, that happened in the second as well. Daddy, we're holding 9-4b. 9b4. 9b4.
9b4. Thank you.
So other Reish Lakish, Adarabah. Achroinim adifa afagav the ikashibud malchus kaiska b'Torah. Even though the second period of the second Beis Hamikdash was dominated by foreign influences, like I said, specifically the Hellenism of the peace, in Kol Zeh, the study of Torah was much greater. And again, it mirrored again the period of the Crusades all the way through the period of the Spanish Inquisition, which was the worst time of the Golis until, of course, the Holocaust. And yet, it was the greatest flowering of Torah, of the Rishonim, that we ever had. And today we benefit from it right on the daf. Rashi, Tosfos, the Balei Tosfos were written during the most terrible times in France and Germany. In fact, the time of the Balei Tosfos stopped by the end of the 1200s because they were expelled from the lands. And yet, that's the period when all of this was written. Right. So, it's remarkable to think about that it is in our worst of times, to quote Charles Dickens, it was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. In the worst of times was the greatest flowering of Torah. It is interesting to note that Chasidus flowered in the Pale of Settlement. In the worst of times of Russia, of the times of the pogroms, at the times when the Russians pushed the Jews into the Pale of Settlement, that is the time of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid Mishras, and so on and so forth. It is a strange thing that when we are pushed down, that is when we flower. Or to put this another way, just so we could see it, the Holocaust happens, 1/3 of our people are wiped out, 2 million people in 1945 are homeless. By 1948, we had Israel again. More people are sitting and learning Torah today than at any time in the last 2,000 years. There are more people learning the daf. There are more people who know how to learn today than at any given time. If you had mentioned this 75 years ago, people would have laughed at you. It is a strange thing. It is when we are at our lowest that our greatest.
I remember after after the Holocaust,
right?
All over in the newspapers and everything, they all predicted that the Jewish people would disappear because intermarriage and everything else, it would disappear completely. So it's just the opposite happened. We got stronger.
We got strong, and it's a funny thing, and Jewish history is replete with this. Every time, look at it this way: when was the Mishnah written? 100 years after the Churban Bayis Sheni.
Right.
When was the Gemara sealed? When we were completely dispersed throughout the world. 400 years after the destruction, the Gemara was sealed. It is a remarkable thing about Jewish history. It replays itself. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. We rise to the occasion somehow to read from the ashes. We rebirth Klal Yisrael. And there is something to be said about that it's almost like HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends us this, brings the ashes, so that from the ashes, from the embers of the ashes, the fire is again relit, and Yiddishkeit flows again. Anyways, let's keep going over here. So Rabbi Yochanan replies, Amalei, Biro Teichiach. In fact, the presence and the absence of the Beis HaMikdash will demonstrate that, in fact, their earlier times were better. Because after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, ultimately we ended up with a second Beis HaMikdash. But now, after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, we are waiting almost 2,000 years, longer than the history from Avram Avinu to Churban Bayis Sheni. From Avram Avinu all the way to the destruction of the second temple is approximately 1,800 years. We are in this gullus longer than our entire history, which is remarkable. Why? So we're still waiting. Says the Gemara, Shalu es Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar was asked, Rishonim Gedolim or Achronim Gedolim? Who was greater? Amalehem Tenu Einechem B'Bira. Put your eyes on the Beis HaMikdash. We don't have the Beis HaMikdash. Proof positive that the first were greater because they were zeichet to see the Beis HaMikdash rebuilt. We have not yet been zeichet to see the Beis HaMikdash rebuilt. Ikedi Amri Amalehem Eidechem Bira. Your witnesses are the Beis HaMikdash, and it's the same idea. Because we don't have it, we're not comfortable. Now, Reish Lakish Hayisachei. Reish Lakish Hayisachei B'Yardina. Reish Lakish. Now again, this needs to be discussed. Charlie, this goes to the story that in Bava Metzia that we discussed earlier this week, you and I. The famous story of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish was a robber, was a highwayman. And he was on one side of the river, and across the river he saw Rabbi Yochanan. He saw Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan was so beautiful, he thought he was a woman. And so with great power, Rabbi Yochanan just jumped over the river, and then realized it was Rabbi Yochanan. The short and long of the story is, Rabbi Yochanan convinced him to do tshuva and come back to Yiddishkeit and learn. And he promised him that he would marry his daughter off to Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan did, and because of this, he was unable to jump back over the river because the weight of Torah, the yoke of Torah was now resting on him. The short and long is that Reish Lakish became the great Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and because of his bad reputation in the past, he made upon himself a rule that he would not speak to anybody in the public sphere. Because he said, I don't want to get reputations. In other words, in case I don't know who I'm talking to, people will think I'm reverting bad to hanging out with the wrong people. So much so that Rabbi Shlokish became so famous for this that if anybody, as the Gemara is about to say, if he did speak to anybody in public, that person was considered completely and utterly trustworthy. But in fact, he didn't speak to anybody. Because he said, if I speak to one person and I don't speak to another person, people are going to think the person I don't speak to is trustworthy. So that's what's going on over here. Reish Lakish was swimming in the Yarden, in the Jordan. Also Rabbi Babachana, who was from Babylon, came and saw him trying to leave the water. Yahavle Yadeh, he stretched out his hand to help him come out of the water. Amalei, Rish Lakish said to Rabbi Baba Chana, Elokah, Sanitza L'chu. Hashem hates you Babylonians. Meaning, back in the days, Hashem hates the fact that people remained in Bavel when Ezra HaSoifa, when Ezra came up to Israel, 442,360 Jews did come up, but the majority remained back in Bavel. We're on 9b5. 9b5. So
you realize if they all had returned with Ezra, you wouldn't have Talmud Bavli.
This is true. We'll talk about that in a minute. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Diksiv, because it says, Im chayma hui nivna leh ti'iras kesef. If she be a wall, let's build her a silver crown. But the imdelasi notzer aleh luach ores. If she be a door, enclose it with a cedar pattern. Had you so made yourself like a wall, and gone up altogether in the days of Ezra Seifa back to Israel, you would have been compared to silver, rock of Shailibay, which is not subject to decay. But now that you compare it to a door, some of you went through it, some of you did not go through the door. The Shamtam Ke'eres Ke'sherokov Sholte Boy. You're compared to a door that's made out of cedar, which is subject to decay. My Eretz, what does it mean that we're compared to a cedar? Ma'ola Sasmorgar. It's just like a cedar door that's left hollow by a worm that eats it out from the inside. My Samsgar, what's the parallel between a hollowed out cedar tree and a Samgar? We're dealing with the divine presence, the Shechina in the second base of English. Amar Rav Aber Baskel. It's the echo of a heavenly voice. Kiditanya. When the last Nevi'im passed away, Chagi Zechariah Malachi, Malachi being the last of all of our Nevi'im, is scalped the Ruach HaKodesh Yisrael, the divine spirit was withdrawn from the Nevuah staff, but we're left with an echo of the heavenly voice. What's going on here? We said before that in the first base of Mikdash, the great taiva, the great desire was for idolatry and immorality and murder. Very emotional people, idolatry. So great was the pool of idolatry that there's a balance, because so great was idolatry that the other side, the spirituality required to believe in Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, was so much harder. Lefum tzara agra, by the amount of effort you put in, so is your reward. Because there was so much pull towards Avodah Zarah, the flip side was the great spiritual grade heights that one can scale in serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That made it a time open to direct nevuah. Ma she'ein came, the Anshe Knesses HaGedolah, between the first and second base of Mikdash, daven to Hashem to take away the taiva, the desire of Avodah Zarah. They said the future generations will not be able to stand up to the taiva of Avodah Zarah. And so the taiva of Avodah Zarah was tamped down in us. But because going into the second base of Mikdash, the desire to do Avodah Zarah started dying down, the flip side, the counter, the spirituality side of heights of spirituality that would have needed to do to counter it wasn't as great as well. So if it wasn't so great, the power of direct nevuah faded away. But nonetheless, what did remain What did remain, and my father just pointed it out before, by having the people remain in Bavel and create the yeshivas of Bavel, ultimately Surya and Pumpadisa, the cities of Surya and Pumpadisa, whose yeshivas lasted until the 900s, until almost the time of Rashi, through Rav Haigai, the longest standing yeshivas in our history. And from there came out Talmud Bavli, but he called from there the heavenly echo, of course, is the ability, is what we call Emunas Chachamim today. That those who sit and learn Torah are given a certain insight to see the world clearer, and that's the heavenly echo. What makes this fascinating is that this explains so much the famous question, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu send to the guy in Bilam a Rasha, a Navi like Bilam? And the Medrash says, so that they shouldn't have tinus, that you sent a Navi to Klal Yisrael, and you didn't send a Navi to us, the people of the world. But of course, that doesn't answer the question, because Moshe Rabbeinu was great. Bilam was a Rasha. The guy could still argue, send us a Navi like Moshe Rabbeinu. But the answer is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends the Navi. The type of Navi you get, that's tied to you as a people. What kind of Navi do you really want? What do you really want? What's going on in your hearts? What the type of people, what you want, it explains what kind of Navi you get. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will send the prophet. But what type of prophet you get is tied to you and your actions. Further, we are now on 9b6. 9b6. But now, how is it possible that Reish Lakish went and started talking with Rabbi Baba Chana about the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was upset that not everybody came up from Bavel? Umar Rebbe Loza, to Moridari Yisrael. Now, if Habib Eloi Hayim Mishtoi Reish Lakish Bahadei, now Reish Lakish did not talk with Rabbi Elazar, who was the master, the Rosh Yeshiva of Eretz Yisrael, demanded Mishtami Reish Lakish Bahadei Bishuk Yahavni Iska Beloi Sahadi. For anybody who Reish Lakish spoke in the marketplace was considered a person of such high esteem, such high integrity, that people would do business with him without requiring any references. Bahadi Rabbi Baba Chana Mishtoi would Reish Lakish then conversed with Rabbi Baba Chana, who Rabbi Eliezer was much more superior as the Rosh Yeshiva of Eretz Yisrael. Amar Papa Shetei Gabra B'nai. You're right. We have to say that we don't have the story completely. Reish Lakish Habib Uzeiri. Maybe it was Reish Lakish and Zeiri, the great Zeiri. Or Rabbi Baba Chana Habib Rabbi Elazar. Maybe it was Rabbi Chana who stretched out his hand to Rabbi Elazar. So now, he also coming to Rabbi Yochanan when Reish Lakish came to Rabbi Yochanan and told him that the Shekhinah did not rest in the second base of Mikdash because the people from Bavel did not come up in mass with Ezra Seifa. Amalei said Rabbi Yochanan, no, Lav Hainu Tama. That is not the time that the second base of Mikdash had much less Shekhinah lying on. Maybe the reason is Siliku Kulev Ezra. Even if all of Babel had come up at the times of Ezra, the divine presence would start and still not dwell in the second base of Mikdash. May Hashem grant beauty to Yepes, but he may dwell in this tents of shame. We are now on today's daf. Yud Amid Aleph. Yud Amid Aleph. Even though Hashem granted beauty to Yepes by privileging the Persians, who are the descendants of Yepes, to build the second base of Mikdash, and the Shekhinah only dwells in the tents of shame, only in the first base of Mikdash, which was built by Shlomo HaMelech, who came, of course, from Shem. Now, Having discussed the Persians, we're going to discuss other nations. Everybody in the art scroll, you can see there's a map that they put together. This map is somewhat perfect, not 100% perfect. Some of it is conjecture, as the art scroll themselves put down. They did their best in trying to understand the Gemara that we're about to learn, which we'll do as quickly as possible. How do we know the Persians come from Yefes? The Ksiv, B'nei Yefes, the sons of Yefes, Goimer, Umogoig, Umodai, V'yovon, V'suval, Umeshech, V'siros. Goimer, Zu Germania, that's Germany. Mogoig, as in the final war of Goig Umogoig. Mogoig, Zu Kandia.
Kandia.
Is Kandia. The best explanation of this one that I like is Mogoig was actually the Mongols. Mogoig was the Mongols, as in Genghis Khan and so on and so forth. In fact, the article brings that in the Kesef HaSefer, that the Great Wall of China was called by the Arabs the Wall of Al-Mogoig. So, on some level, that's to me like the best thing over here. We were dealing with the Mongols, which today, of course, Mongolia is not considered anything, but for 3-4 generations, from Genghis Khan to Kublai Khan, were the greatest conquerors in the history of the world. So, Modai Kimashmoy, that is Modai, as in Parasu Modai. Yovon Zu Macedonia, that's like Alexander Mokhdam, Greece. Tuval ze base unaiki. Tuval is based on Nike, Mesher Zumusia, Tires, and in the art scroll, if you take a look, they put over there one that says it's probably close to in northwest Turkey, and the other one is to the more to the west of Turkey again. I'm not exactly 100% sure. Tires pligi barav simoy v'rabonan v'amilay Rab Simoy v'rabonan chad omazu base Teraiki. This is base Teraiki. This is an area, and again, as part of the north tip of Turkey. Maybe that's where
Teraiki means Turkey.
Turkey must mean Turkey. V'chad omazu paras. This is
actually you should read it Tarkai.
Tarkai. Except the article cites of Teraiki. I don't know why, but it should be Tarkai. It's true.
Right.
But Chad Ama Paras, some say it means Paras, which again, depending where you look on the map, Iran and Iraq and Turkey,
Paras is Persia.
they all border each other. So again, Tanya Rab Yosef, Tiros Zu Paras. Okay, now the Gemara goes further. Savto Virama B'Savtecha. The first words of Chum, the sons of Cush, the first one of Chum, were Savta, Rama, and Savka. Tani Rabbi Yosef, Sakisto, Gavaisa, Visakisa, Baraisa. Inner Saxon and other Saxon. In other words, West Afghanistan. The word stan means a country. We're talking about that area of West Afghanistan, is the best to put it this way. Between this and the other was a distance of 100 parsa. The Kifa Alpha Parsoi 10A3. We're up to 10A3, and the circumference of the outer one is 1,000 parsa. In other words, there's a mountain range, and this is, if you measure up the mountain range, it has some sort of square mileage of 1,000 parsecs, 2,270 to 3,000 miles in its area. Fatihi Rashis and Nimrod's kingdom, Mamalata Babel, the Erech, the Achbe, the Kalne. Babel Kimashmoy. Babel means exactly what it is, Babylon. Erech Zu Oirichus is Oirichus, okay, which is again the lower chelik of of the Euphrates River. Va'aked zeh Baskar, that's Baskar, which is a royal city in the northern part of Babel. Kalna zeh Goifik Ginfi, is Neufert Ginfi. So, this is a city, Nipper. I'm reading straight from the art school over here. There's a river that's called the River Nifty. So there we go. Mina Haaretz Ahu Yotza Ashur. From this land, Ashur went forth. Ashur is both the name of a person and cities that he built.
Assyria.
Tani Rabbi Yosef, Ashur Zu Silak. This is Silak, which is really Assyria, which if we know is Syria, and then above that became Assyria, which if you look at the map on the previous page, was leading back down into the Iranian, not into the Arabian Peninsula, but more into the top part above Damascus, heading towards Iraq. Even as Ninveh is Kolach. Ninveh Kemashvoi was a big city in Assyria. Rechoivos Ir Zu Parasta Mishan is Pyrrhus of Mishan. Okay, this is mentioned. It's the royal canal, maybe an island formed by the Euphrates and the Tigris, and the Kolach Zu Parasta Vursiv is Vursiv, which is a city again in the Euphrates in the center of Iraq. The Es Resen ben Ninveh ben Kolach Bihu Ir Agdoila. And Resen was between Ninveh and Kolach. Resen Ze Ak Tasteful. Is Ak Tasteful. Where is that? That's a city, if you look at Art Scroll, a city about 20 miles southeast of Baghdad. And Dr. Gemara, who he Ira Gedoyla, any day I don't know if Ninveh Ira Gedoyla, if Ninveh is considered the great city in Reses Ira Gedoyla. Tishuayme, but Ninveh I say Ira Gedoyla Lalikim, Mahalish Shleish Yomim, and Yaina that we read on Yom Kippur. And Ninveh was an enormously great city, a 3-day journey. I'm a Ninveh here, Ira Gedoyla. And Ninveh is the great city. Okay, fine. We are now on 10A4. 10A4. Since we're talking about names, the Gemara keeps going. The Shema Chimon, and this is at the time of the Meraglim, of the spies. The Shema Chimon Sheishai V'Talma Yelidei Oanok. And you see there, and when Kaleb went to by Hebron, where there were Achima and Shisha and Talmai, the offspring of the Anak of the giant. Tana, Achimon, Miyoim Sheba'akim, the most powerful of his brothers. Shishai, Shemesim Isaretz Kishechichos. He rendered the earth runes by his footsteps. He was so large. Talmai Sheshimim Eseretz Teloyim. He made in the earth many pharaohs when he walked. Dover Acher, Achumon Bona Anos, Achiman built Anos, Shishai Bona Olosh, Talmai Bona Talbus. Yelidei Ho'anak, the offspring of the giant, Shemahanikin Achama became Osan, because they made the sun into a necklace because of their towering height. The idea was they were so tall that when you looked up, the sun, when you were looking directly into the sun to see them.
Black, yeah.
Okay, exactly who they were and all that goes back very much to the Medrash and the end of, say, Parshas Bereshis, when the Malachim came down, when Malachim said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, look how bad the people on earth are, why did you create them? And Hashem said, that's because they're down there with the Yetzirah. You guys are up here with no Yetzirah. And the Malachim said, we can go down, no problem. We can be Oymed bin Yisoyin. We can stand. We're not going to have a problem. So Hashem said, really? And he sent down a couple of the Malachim who were complaining. Within 24 hours, says the Medrash,
They raped the girl.
They raped the girls. They went immediately to the lowest depths of depravity, right then and there. And that of course is the great lesson. It's the reason why human beings are greater than malachim, because it's very easy to be holy when you don't have a Yetzer Hara, an evil inclination banging at you. That's why bechira, choice. That is why we were born in freedom. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created us in freedom, the freedom of choice, to choose. And he tells us, Becharta b'chayim, choose life, choose wisely. Says the Gemara Vaita, Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Amar Rebbe, Asida Roimi Shetipu Biyad Paras. Rome is destined to fall into the hands of Iraq, of Persia. Shnema, Shimu Atas Hashem Yoad El Edoin Umachshavoisim Ashish Chosav El Yoishrei Teimanim Loyis Chovu Tziire Atzanim Loyasim Aleim Giveim. Therefore, hear the counsel of Hashem that he's divided against Edom, and his thoughts that he conceived against the dwellers of Tamar, of Ethiopia. The youngest of the flock will drag them off. He will indeed devastate their dwellings. The youngest, by definition, is what he called, would be Persia. Maskevla Rabba Barula, my master the height Suriyat Sain Parasu. Where do you see that the youngest of the flock means Persia? Diksiv ha'ayla shariyisa ba'ala kronim malchet modayu faras. The horn ram that you saw symbolizes the kings of Madai and Paras. This had to do with Daniel when he had the vision of the coming of the four nations that would be coming over the history of the world. The Ema Yavan, but maybe the youngest means Yavan. Diksiv. But so Tzopir Hasir Melech Yavan, and the he goat, that is the king of Yavan, Alexander Mokdam. It's called Kisalag Rab Chabida Bar Surmake. When Chabiba Surmake came to Eretz Yisrael, Amikamedim Rabbanan. He stated Rabba Barula's objection to Rebbe's statement that ultimately Rome will fall to Persia, and he said Amalei. The Rebbe said no. Someone who doesn't understand the simple explanation of Psukim is challenging Rebbe. What does it mean, the youngest of the flock? Zutra da'achoi, the youngest of the brothers, the youngest of the sons of Yefes. The Tani Rabbi Yosef, Tiras that Paras. Tiras is Paras. Amar Rabbi Baba Chan, Amar Rabbi Yachim Misham Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi. He also says Rome ultimately is going to fall into the hands of Persia. It's a Kal V'chaim. Uma make the Shvishan. She B'nua B'nei Shem Rechibu Kastim. Just like the first base of English, which was built by the descendants of Shem Shlomo Melech, was destroyed by the Chaldean, i.e. the Medes. And the Kasim fell into the hands of the Persians. Ultimately, the Persians the Chassidim will destroy the first base of Migdash. We're now on 1085. Migdash Sheni Shebino Parisa Bechiri Raimim, that the second base of Migdash, which was built by the Persians and destroyed by the Romans. Isn't it logical that the Romans should then fall into the hands of the Persians? Amarav, Asida Parash, Tibu Biadraimi. In fact, it's just the opposite. Persia will ultimately fall into the hands of Rome. The builders will fall into the hands of the destroyers. The ones who built the second base of Hamikdash, the Persians, will fall into the hands of the Romans who destroyed it. Amalei yes, Gezeras Melechu, it is the Gezerah of the king of Hashem. This is the way he wants it. Ikedi Amri, Amalahu Inu Nami Hosisrei Bei Kanishta. The Persians also, in fact, destroyed many shuls, Beis HaKnesses, and shuls are called a Beis Hamikdash Ma'at, a small Beis Hamikdash, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Asuli Migdash v'shachanti b'soicham. Make for me a Beis Hamikdash, and I will rest in them. Asuli Migdash singular. Make for me a Migdash v'shachanti b'soicham, and I will rest in them. Says Chazal, what is the them? Elu batik and Esiyah Subatim Midrash Shel Bavel. Those are the shuls and the learning places of Bavel. So the Persians who destroyed our shuls, right? They too will fall to Rome. Tananami Hachi, we learned this way in the Baraisa. I see the Parash that people be at Roimi. In the future, Paras will fall into the hands of Rome. Number one, they destroyed a lot of shuls. Gezeris Melachu, it's a gezerah of the king. Sheyiplu boinem biyad, so that the builders will fall into the hands of the destroyers. Mashiach will not come until the wicked kingdom of Rome has overrun the entire world for 9 months. He will surrender them until the time that one who gives birth has given birth. And the rest of Mashiach's brothers will return with the children of Israel. The other 10 Shvatim will then return. Now, we just finished essentially the Haggadah. So, now we go back. Again, I don't understand all that we learned just now. I don't really understand this issue of Persia and Rome and Persia, and how does that reconcile to today's world, where clearly, if we looked at Rome by itself, Italy is nothing. And Persia,
Rome is Christianity.
Correct. So
it's not Italy, just Italy.
And yet today Christianity is on the wane. Christianity is no longer the all-powerful church. The church is not powerful.
We're not talking about the church. We're talking about just
so that's what
all the Christian
So we're
countries.
talking about a better way to look at this. It used to be called the Christian world. We need to change the words to the Western world versus the Eastern world. It moves in time. It was a pagan world dominated by Rome. Then it was a Christian world dominated by Roman Catholicism in the West and the Russian Orthodox Church in the East. Then it was dominated by the Reformation, Protestantism. And today it's dominated by secularism, right? But either way, it's always a clash of civilizations. That is what the world, whether we realize it here, East or West, is a clash of civilizations. It's a clash in political theory. It's a clash in economic theory. That's always the way it is. It's where one side has one way, automatically the other side will have the opposite version. So even now, where China, unfortunately, is creeping up on America to become the #1 economy in the world, and its economy is now a capitalist economy, but they're making an argument that a capitalist economy could only work with their type of government, with a centralized strongman government. And we, of course, say that the economy, capitalism, only works with democracy. And that, of course, is the great thing. And it's an argument that we're losing, by the way. It's an argument that we're losing, and that's a very scary proposition. Anyways, Gemara goes further. We said that the Kohen Gadol was sequestered in the Lishchas Parhadran. So, Kol Lishchas Shaya b'Migdash, all chambers that were in the Migdash, Lo Yehoyu Lehem Mezuzah, did not require mezuzah. Chutz min Lishchas Parhadran. It says for the Lishchas Parhadran. Why? Shahaya beis dira leKohen Gadol, because it served as a dwelling for the Kohen Gadol during the week of Yom Kippur, so it required a mezuzah. The reason why the rest of the Beis Hamikdash did not is the real reason why a shul, in fact, does not require a mezuzah, because it belongs to the kehillah. It's a non-profit. It doesn't belong to any individual. It belongs to everybody. And something that belongs to everybody belongs to nobody. And therefore, there's no mezuzah. But where there is some sort of living arrangement, that we would require a mezuzah. So that's what we're saying. Because
that's why a Beis Medrash, where people sleep there sometimes, needs a mezuzah.
Right. Very good. So wait,
the
hold
Beis
that.
HaKnesses doesn't need it.
Right, and wait, hold. Remember, you said that, Daddy, because the Gemara is coming up and is bringing that point up specifically. So, the Amar Rabbi Yehuda v'haloi kama lishchos chaya b'mikdash. There were many lishchos in the mikdash. V'hoyel beis tira v'loyel mezuzah, and there were places where they slept. In other words, there were many places where the Kahanim who were going to be on call for the next day slept in those things, and they didn't get mezuzahs. So the answer, says Rabbi Yehuda, in fact, the whole base of Mikdash is a complete non-profit belonging to nobody. So why did the Prahadin get a mezuzah? According to Rabbi Yehuda, Lishkas Prahadin Gezerah Haisa. It was merely a rabbinical Gezerah. It was a rabbinical Gezerah. And as we're going to see later, the reason why they did that is because they wanted that room to look like a home and not a prison cell. If you look at the Rashi, Gezerah Haisa, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 lines from the bottom. L'kamei, later on, Mefarish, it's going to explain, Gezerah Shema Yomru Kayin Gadol B'Beisa Asurim Hu Tchabush. If you're going to say they took the Kayin Gadol into a prison, they're imprisoning the Kayin Gadol before the Yom Kippur, as opposed to bringing him into a home to learn with him, etc. That's the way people's mind, they're going to say the Kayin was forcibly grabbed from his home and separated from his wife. So in other words, in order not to say that, they put a mezuzah on the door to say that, no, this is also his living place. My time, with just another 5 minutes. My time of the Rabbi Yehuda, what's the time of the Rabbi Yehuda that says the Prahadrin was not required minatayra mezuzah? Amar Rabbi says, Kesava Rabbi Yehuda, Kol bayis sheino asuli yimoisa chamuli yimoisa geshamim eino bayis. A house that's not made for both summer and winter is not deemed a true house. 10a6. Says the Gemara, Eisvei Abaya, is that a fact? Well, Ksiv, KC is based, Chachayrev, El Beis HaKayitz, and I will strike the winter house along with the summer house. So the Pasuk says over there, you see there's such a thing as a winter house and a summer house. So in other words, if you have a house in New York and you have a house in Boca Raton, and you're using your house in your Boca Raton as a vacation home, it still needs a mezuzah. Amalei. Where the house is referred to as a house, my winter house and my summer house, but not simply a house that's simply called a bias. An unqualified term house only refers to a house that is a full year long usage. Eisvei Abaya comes Abayas and questions Rabba. Regarding bringing in tevua grains that were brought into a sukkah during the sukkah festival. So now we have to explain. We learned this before. All grains are tevel, untithed, and required to be nafresh mice, chumas mices, to separate the tithing. When does the tefua get the name tevel? Only by gemar malacha, after it's been harvested and brought into the house, brought into the storage house or into your home, then it's considered ready to be used, and then it becomes usher to have any anah, even to snack on it, okay, until you separate your trumas maisvus. So now it's sukkahs and you have grains, and you bring it into your sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda Mechayim, Rabbi Yehuda says, you're now obligated to tithe it. It's considered complete. It's been brought into your home, albeit it's your sukkah, and it has to be tithed. The Chachamim poichim, Chachamim say absolutely not. It's not considered brought into the storage home or into your home, and therefore it's only in the sukkah, and it's not yet considered complete, and you don't yet have to tithe it. V'tanya law, and we learned it according to elaborating on Rabbi Yehuda as follows: Rabbi Yehuda mechayev be'erev u'b'mezuzah u'b'maisa. He says that a sukkah is a house, and therefore you have to put up a mezuzah on your house, and you have to make an erev chatzeres. If there are other houses or other sukkahs in the courtyard, you guys got to make an erev chatzeres, and you have to tithe the maisa of the grains that went into the sukkah. So you see that Rabbi Yehuda considers the sukkah a house, even though it's not an all year long. It's not an all year long house. It's a very temporary house. So you're going to say, if you want to say Rabbi Yehuda only said that a sukkah is considered like a house only on a rabbinical level, so then his position is like the Lishchas HaPahadrin, just like the Lishchas HaPahadrin, which is only rabbinically requires a mezuzah. Same thing over here. No, we can't say that. The Erev Chatzeres and the mezuzah are rabbinical in level. They could be something that they put in. Ela Maisel, which is a diaraisa, is biblically in nature. How could you say it's rabbinical? They would not have put on such an issue to stop people from eating and chas v'sholom. What do you call it? Putting it on? That doesn't make any sense. We're now on Amid Beis. Yud Amid Beis. 10b1. Right? So says the Gemara, 10b1. Dilma osi la frushim and achiyav alapota. They would not have put such a gezerah because heaven forbid you might come to tithe. Produce that needs tithing biblically, you're going to use that produce on behalf of the produce that biblically is not required. Or the other way, or you use the produce that in fact really biblically does not require tithing and use it to tithe produce that does require tithing, which means you're going to blow it. Chazal would never make a gezerah to put a decree which might lead to a terrible avera of eating food that's still tevel. So says the Gemara, Hello Amar Abaya, the Shiva Kulam. Nobody disagrees that during the 7 days that the Kohen Gadol was in the Lishchas Prahadin, that you may need to put a mezuzah, as we'll see, for the very reasons. Either everybody agrees that the one he called the time that biblically speaking, midiaraisa, you have to put a mezuzah, just like Rabbi Yehuda holds that biblically speaking on a sukkah, it's called a house, and you have to put up a sukkah, you have to put up a mezuzah. Ki pligi b'shaya ma'isa all the rest of the years. Rabbanon Savri Gazin Shar Yemaisa Shana Atu Shiva. We say that the Bahadin should always have a mezuzah the whole year, because on account of the 7 days when the Kohen will live there. Because if you don't have it the rest of the year, people will look at this whole room and say something's very fishy about it. No, we're not so worried about it. The Bahadin only gets it. We do put a mezuzah on it a whole year, but that the rest of the year, the reason is that the room should not look like a jail when we bring the Kohen Gadol there before Yom Kippur. Amalei Rava v'sukkahs chachag b'chag ketani, but the Mishnah said before a sukkah during sukkahs, and in that Mishnah, the Chazal, the Rabbanon, the Tanakama exempted it from a mezuzah. So if the sukkah is exempt from a mezuzah, well then the Lishchas Parhajit should also be exempt from a mezuzah. Ela Marava B'Shar Yemaisa Shana Kula Amaloi Pligi D'Petura. The rest of the year, everybody says the Lishchas Parhajit does not need a mezuzah the rest of the year. Ki Pligi B'Shiva, where we're talking about in the 7 days of the Kohen Gadol stay. Ubisuka tamaluchud, ulismishcha tamaluchud. Each has their own reason. Sukkah tamaluchud. The sukkah it goes because Rabbi Yehuda letamei. Rabbi Yehuda says that the sukkah requires a mezuzah because Rabbi Yehuda is going to his own reasoning. 10b2, the Omar sukkah diras keva be'inan. The sukkah needs to be a permanent residence. In the first Mishnah Masech the sukkah, there's a machlokes. The Tanakhama says that a sukkah is not allowed to be higher than 20 amas. It cannot be so tall. The reason is it cannot be a permanent residence. Rabbi Yehuda says just the opposite. Yehuda says, Adarabah, it could be certainly high as 20 amas, even higher, because I want permanency. So therefore, since he wants permanency in the sukkah, Mechayiv mezuzah. If it's a permanent thing, it's not a clubhouse, it needs a mezuzah. The Rabbanim say that the sukkah needs to be a temporary residence. That's why it's not allowed to be more than 20 amas high. And if it's temporary, it doesn't require a mezuzah. And the argument regarding the lishcha pahatin is another principle. Rabbanim the Rabbanim say a room, an enforced residency where you forcefully, as it were, take the Kohen Gadol, was duty bound to take up residence in the Lishkas Pahajan and separate from his wife, is still considered a residence and requires a mezuzah. Rabbi Yehuda an enforced residence is not considered a residence. Midiraisa does not require a mezuzah. And the only reason why it does get a mezuzah, the Rabbanan who take the go, and the Rabbanan were misakin to put on that room a mezuzah. So that people shouldn't say that the Kohen Gadol is locked in jail because the absence of the mezuzah will draw attention to the fact that he was forced into the room. So we don't want to give that impression. So we say we put a mezuzah, and this is where we end. Baruch Hashem, we are now back on the dot.